I had spent months planning the trip to the Andes, chasing the idea of solitude and raw landscapes. The air there was thin and cold, and even in September, the sun burned bright against the pale rocks and sparse vegetation above the treeline. I wasn't alone. I had two friends who knew the region well, locals who had grown up in villages tucked into valleys far below. They had suggested a small guest house perched on a ridge, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound up from the nearest town. It was a place not found on most maps, a house that promised isolation and quiet. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun slanting across jagged ridges, painting everything in golden light. The house itself was modest, made of stone and wood, perched at an angle that made it seem like it had been set there carefully to survey the slopes. There was no livestock, no signs of life nearby other than the thin, trembling grasses clinging to the mountainside. The air smelled of dust, faint wildflowers, and the cold tang of high altitude. At first, the days passed normally. The mornings were sharp and cold. Mist rolled down the valleys, dissolving into sunlight, leaving dew on the wooden railing of the porch. We hiked short trails nearby, exploring rocky outcrops and narrow passes, sometimes stopping to watch birds wheeling across the slopes. The silence was absolute, broken only by our footsteps, the occasional screech of a raptor, and the faint wind threading through the sparse trees. The house itself was sparse. Inside, the rooms were clean but bare, with plain wooden furniture and thin mattresses. There was a kitchen, small and functional, but nothing personal. No decoration, no books, no pictures, just clean surfaces and walls painted a pale cream. The windows were large and offered expansive views of the valleys, but even from inside, the sense of emptiness was tangible. The first night, we were woken by the sound of bells. Small, high-pitched bells that chimed intermittently. At first, I thought it might be hikers or shepherds in the distance. But there were no shepherds, no livestock, no paths leading directly from the house to the nearest village. The sound was faint but unmistakable, and it moved around the house, almost like someone was walking circles on the slope. I stepped outside, looking into the darkness. The mountain contours were shadowed in the moonlight, trees barely visible as dark smudges. Nothing. No figures, no movement, no wind shaking the branches. The bells stopped after a while, leaving an echo that seemed to hang in the cold air long after the sound had ended. The next night, the bells returned, and I started to notice a pattern. They didn't overlap. One would ring in one direction, then another from somewhere else, moving gradually around the house. It was deliberate, measured. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had gotten hold of small bells someone left around. Maybe wind carried something along the rocks in a way that sounded like chimes. But the sound had a rhythm that felt intentional. The noise moved closer to the house each night. I would lie in bed, listening, imagining the trajectory, the way each bell seemed to circle. My friends were uneasy too, though they said nothing. The house was cold, drafty, and quiet between the chimes, and the thin walls did little to obscure the clarity of the ringing. By the third night, I could feel my stomach tighten as soon as the first bell sounded. It became impossible to ignore, a constant, insistent presence that seemed to measure our attention, circling without fail, yet never letting itself be found. On the fourth night, one bell rang directly outside the wall of the bedroom where I slept. I froze, listening. It was right there, not a meter away. The sound lingered, delicate and metallic. I got up slowly, walked to the window, and looked out. The slope was empty, dark, nothing moved. There were no footprints, no rocks disturbed, nothing to suggest that anything, or anyone, had passed. The wind was calm. The moonlight revealed only the uneven mountain grass, shadows stretching across the stones, yet not a single bell was in sight. I crouched, scanning the terrain with every sense. Every night before, the sound had come from a distance. This time, it had been right there. There was a distinct shift in the feeling of the space, an intimacy to the sound that was almost invasive, the knowledge that someone or something had been deliberately close, unseen. Morning brought no explanation. I found my friends on the porch, quiet, their expressions tight. They had heard it too. We went down to the small terrace that overlooked the slope and found small piles of stones arranged in arcs. Atop each pile sat a bell, the same kind of high, delicate bells that had circled the house each night. We had not placed them. None of us had even touched any stones the previous evening. The arcs seemed deliberate, ritualistic even, positioned to form patterns around the house. I examined them carefully. The stones were native to the slope, weathered and light, easy to move, but each pile was precise. The bells balanced on top without tipping. I ran my fingers along the grass and soil nearby. No footprints, no marks at all. Nothing indicated how they had arrived there. The arc spread out in every direction, surrounding the house, the placement methodical. I stepped back and realized that the patterns mirrored the paths of the bells from the previous nights. Each pile corresponded to the directions and distances I had perceived the sounds taking as they circled. We packed our things quickly, the unease pressing down with every movement. The light had shifted low in the afternoon, the sun dipping behind a ridge, the mountains glowing a deep amber. The air felt heavier as we loaded our packs into the small SUV that had brought us up. The host emerged from the house as we started the engine, standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets. He didn't ask where we were going or why we were leaving so suddenly. There was no expression of surprise or concern, only a neutral, steady gaze. It struck me as odd, though perhaps it was not meant to be odd at all. Perhaps this was how things were. We drove down the winding road in silence, the dirt crunching beneath the tires, glancing back only once at the house perched above the treeline. The stone piles gleamed faintly in the sun, and a bell in one arc caught the light, reflecting a tiny glimmer. The sight stayed in my mind for hours, the realization that someone, or something, had been at work while we slept. There was no malice in it, no threat, but the meticulous care and invisibility of it had left a weight in the air that I couldn't shake. By the time we reached the valley floor, the warmth of lower altitudes and the bustle of the town returned a sense of normalcy, though the memory of the house, the bells, and the arcs of stones remained vivid. I thought about it often afterward, replaying the slow circling of the bells, the quiet arrival of the stones, the way nothing was ever explained. Nothing about the place was unsafe or violent. There were no threats we could identify, yet the precision of the acts, the invisible attention, left a resonance that was impossible to ignore. I never learned the reason behind the bells or the stone arcs, and I didn't feel the need to ask. Some things, I realized, were meant to be observed, not understood, and the house above the treeline had made its presence felt in a way that stayed with me long after we had left. I arrived at the cabin in northern Minnesota in late January, the sky low and gray, the kind of cold that seeps through boots and mittens even before you step inside. The drive had been long, more than 2 hours on snow-packed roads that wound between bare, skeletal trees, their branches heavy with frost. I wanted silence, the kind of isolation that comes with being far from anyone, anything familiar. The divorce had left me hollow in a way that made noise unbearable, even the wind too loud. This cabin, advertised as remote and lightly used in the winter months, seemed perfect. I parked my truck in the small clearing, kicked the snow off my boots, and let the icy air slap my face before I carried my gear inside. The cabin was small, built from rough timber, with a low ceiling and a single bedroom at one end. The living area had a wood stove and a table that looked older than I could place. There was a faint smell of smoke and something else, almost damp, that reminded me of the floor of a forest after snow melts. The walls were thin but solid, and the windows were fogged with condensation that I wiped away one by one, revealing a landscape of white that stretched without end. I unpacked slowly, stacking firewood near the stove and setting up my fishing gear on a corner table. Ice fishing wasn't the point so much as sitting still on a frozen lake, staring at the gray horizon, and letting my thoughts unravel. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the eardrums after hours. I went to bed early, still adjusting to the dim light of the northern winter. Just past midnight, I woke to the sound of a snowmobile. It was soft at first, muffled by distance and snow, and I told myself it was someone on a trail far behind the cabin. The listing had warned about snowmobiles using the area, so it didn't bother me. I listened for a few minutes, but then the sound didn't fade. It circled. It moved behind the treeline, around the cabin, but never closer, never farther. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or the way sound carries over frozen lakes, but the rhythm was too precise. I imagined someone on the trail watching, keeping the engine at a constant pace, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Eventually, I forced sleep back into my mind. The next day I ignored it. The snow was thick and soft, and the sky was a uniform gray that blurred the horizon. I set up near the lake, drilling holes through the ice and letting the tip-ups float, watching the black water beneath the thick ice. The isolation felt good, almost healing. I chopped wood and carried it inside, stacked it neatly, and started the fire. Evening came quickly, the sun barely touching the tops of the trees before vanishing. Around midnight, the sound returned. This time I stayed awake, listening. The engine whined softly and then circled, never moving closer, never moving away. It passed behind the tree-line, stopping at the same point for longer than it should have if someone was moving around. I stepped outside, boots crunching in the fresh snow, and scanned the tree-line. No tracks, not a single indentation, no exhaust smell. The air was empty except for the snowmobile, which hummed the same way, circling the trees in a loop only it could know. I watched until the sound stopped, eventually returning inside, heart racing, fire warming my hands. The third night was worse. I had started noticing details in the cabin I hadn't before. Carvings under the table, almost hidden unless you crouched. Tall shapes, limbs bent at odd angles, repeated over and over. Not artistic, not decorative. They felt like warnings, like someone had scratched them in a hurry, leaving them for anyone who noticed. The wood was old, splintered in places, and the carvings had darkened with age. I traced one with my finger, counting the shapes. Each one was slightly different, but the posture was always the same. Tall, elongated, a kind of silent crouch that made my stomach tighten. I kept telling myself it was nothing, probably the work of a bored teenager or an artist who had once stayed here. Still, the feeling lingered, like the cabin was aware I was alone. That night, when the snowmobile started again, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my coat, hat, and gloves and stepped outside. The wind cut through the layers, and the snow crunched under my boots. The sound was there, circling, not changing, not approaching. I followed it toward the tree-line, keeping my eyes on the dim outline of trees against the gray sky. The snow was fresh, untouched, but the engine moved as if following a trail I couldn't see. I walked in a wide arc, trying to pinpoint where it might be coming from, but the sound remained the same distance, rotating around me. I stopped in the middle of the clearing and listened. It paused. I felt my pulse in my ears. Then it started again, moving behind the trees in a loop, predictable but impossible. No footprints. No other noise. Nothing to indicate someone had been there. I returned inside, heart still thudding. I checked every window, every door, making sure locks were secure. The fire had died down to embers, and the room smelled faintly of smoke and pine. I tried to sleep, but every time I drifted off, the sound came back. Circling, methodical, unchanging. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn. By morning, I decided to leave early. I packed slowly, savoring the quiet daylight that seemed safer, less strange than the night. Before I left, I cleaned the stove, stacked the remaining wood, and ran a brush over the carvings under the table. I photographed them, more out of habit than curiosity. When I finally got back to town, I called the host to ask about the cabin, about its history. He sounded surprised I had been there alone in the winter. He told me it had always been rented year-round, though I had seen the guest book had stopped in 2007. He didn't comment on the carvings or the sound, just the usual polite reassurances about snowmobiles and winter trails. He said it was popular with those who liked solitude. I never returned. The experience stayed with me longer than I expected, not in the form of fear I could name, but in a quiet tension that stayed behind my ribs. The sound made no sense, the carvings no explanation. Yet the cabin was solid, real, and unchanged. There was no magic, no supernatural cause. Just isolation, old wood, snow, and the way a place can feel alive in the wrong ways when no one is watching. I rented other cabins after that, never alone, always with someone nearby. But the memory of circling engines, the silent snow, and the strange marks under that table followed me for months. A reminder that some quiet is not empty, and some solitude carries its own weight. I moved to the city in late November, my car loaded with boxes and a quiet sense of unease I couldn't place. The apartment I rented was small, on the 5th floor of a concrete building that smelled faintly of wet cement and dust, the kind of smell that lingers in corners and settles into carpet fibers. I was alone, no friends in the city yet, no co-workers to meet for lunch, just me and the rhythm of moving my life into a new space. The building was older than I expected, the hallways narrow and dimly lit, and I had to jiggle the key 3 times before it caught in the door. Once inside, the apartment was almost unnervingly bare. Minimal furniture, pale walls, and the absence of any personal touches made it feel temporary in a way that immediately set me on edge. The living room had a couch that was more form than comfort, a small coffee table with no signs of use, and a kitchen that looked like it had been cleaned with bleach and left to air out for months. Everything was clean but cold. The bathroom stood out. I didn't notice it immediately, but it struck me later how unusual it was. The walls were white, almost reflective themselves, and the light was harsh, fluorescent, buzzing faintly overhead. There was a mirror above the sink, framed in a brushed metal, that made it look like it belonged in a laboratory rather than a home. I brushed it off at first, thinking it just matched the stark style of the apartment. I hung my clothes in the closet and unpacked a few essentials, everything practical and minimal, and tried to settle into the rhythm of working from home. The days passed in a haze of empty rooms, cardboard boxes, and the occasional trip to the corner store. I didn't mind the silence at first. It was something I expected when relocating for work, a pause between the life I had left behind and the life I was starting. The first night, I stayed up later than usual, staring at a spreadsheet on my laptop, my back aching from the chair. When I finally got up to brush my teeth, the bathroom light flickered. It wasn't unusual. The building's electricity often hummed and buzzed, the lights occasionally fluttering as if adjusting themselves. I looked into the mirror to wash my face and froze. My reflection wasn't there. I saw the room behind me perfectly, the sink, the pale tiles, the faint shadow where the window light should have hit. But not me. My hand hovered over the faucet. Nothing. I leaned forward, squinting, the reflection sharp and clear in the fluorescent glare, but empty. I tested it in different positions, angling my body, tilting my head, stepping closer, stepping back. Always the same. The room behind me was reflected, but I was not. The sensation was immediate, a cold awareness that something was off in the space I had just claimed as my own. I backed out of the bathroom slowly, my pulse accelerating, convincing myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a defect in the glass, a warped pane. But when I reached for my phone to take a picture, the screen displayed exactly the same thing. No reflection, only the bathroom behind me. My pulse rose higher. I set the phone down, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited for some explanation to settle in. Morning came eventually, gray light spilling across the floorboards, and with it, my reflection returned. I looked at myself in the mirror for several long minutes, tracing my features with a finger, noting the way the light touched my hair and shoulders. Everything seemed normal again. I tried to dismiss the previous night as fatigue or stress. I had been moving and working long hours, and the absence of other people in the building left my mind untested. The days that followed were tense but controlled. I kept a schedule, left the apartment when I could, and avoided spending too long in the bathroom at night. I didn't sleep well. Each flicker of the fluorescent light made me pause, and I found myself hesitating before turning the knob, half expecting the mirror to betray me again. I rationalized it every time. Old glass. Distorted reflection. It had to be. The host, when I emailed him, said the glass was old, prone to imperfections, that it sometimes reflected light strangely. That explanation was plausible, and I clung to it, trying to convince myself I wasn't imagining the experience. Still, the unease persisted, lodged at the base of my skull and tightening my chest whenever I entered the bathroom after dark. I began to notice other things about the apartment. Subtle noises, soft creaks from the floorboards, the hum of pipes in the walls. Things I could dismiss, but that added to the overall sensation of wrongness. The light flickered more frequently at night, a stuttering pulse that mirrored my heartbeat. My own reflection became an unspoken test. Every night, I would check it, standing at the same angle, watching the room behind me, waiting for the absence. Some nights it remained, some nights it vanished entirely. I stopped telling myself it was just the mirror, began to understand that the sensation of being unseen was the more troubling part. No one else was here to notice me, and the apartment was too stark, too empty, for any distraction. It was just me, the lights, and the mirror that refused to reflect me. By the last morning, the tension had grown so thick I barely slept. I packed the few remaining items, moved the suitcase toward the door, and stepped into the bathroom one final time. The light was steady now, and my reflection was there, trembling slightly, eyes wide from the accumulated fear of a week spent doubting reality. I turned to leave, and that's when it happened. The mirror cracked, a single vertical line slicing through the glass cleanly, silently. No sound, no shatter, just a perfect fracture down the center. I stared at it, my reflection splitting in two. The two have slightly misaligned, each showing me in the same clothes I had packed, but somehow subtly different, a distortion I couldn't explain. My hand hovered over the crack. The surface was cold, unyielding. I ran my finger along the line, felt the vibration of glass under skin, but nothing else. I took a deep breath and left, locking the door behind me, suitcase in hand, heart still racing from the subtle finality of the fracture. The building smelled the same, the street outside gray and quiet, and I walked to the elevator without looking back. I never returned to that apartment. The host sent a brief email thanking me for staying. I never asked about the mirror again, and I never needed to. In hindsight, it didn't matter why it happened or how. The week had left its mark in subtle ways. The caution in my movements, the unease at empty rooms, the sense that even familiar reflections could betray you. I carried the memory with me through new apartments, new cities, always pausing to note how light and glass interacted, how a simple reflection could feel like an unseen presence. The mirror didn't have to explain itself. Its silence, and the way it refused to reflect me at night, was enough. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of escaping everything, leaving the city behind, and being completely alone in the high desert of Southern California was irresistible. I invited 2 friends from college, people I trusted, people I knew could handle a bit of discomfort. We wanted isolation, and the Airbnb listing delivered. A single cinderblock house perched in the desert, miles from the nearest road, surrounded by nothing but sand, scrub, and jagged rock formations. There were no neighbors, no streetlights, no sound except the wind. The photos made it look perfect, stark, quiet, a place where the sky was vast and unbroken. We weren't concerned with comfort. The listing made it clear that this was about distance from the world. The host's instructions were precise and slightly urgent. He insisted we arrive before sunset, claiming it was for our own safety. The drive out from Palm Springs was long, winding, and almost entirely empty. At some points, I thought we'd lost the trail completely. We had GPS, but the dirt roads split and twisted in ways that made sense only if you were familiar with the terrain. We got distracted, arguing lightly over directions, and ended up arriving well after dark. Almost immediately, my phone buzzed with 3 messages from the host within 10 minutes, each more pointed than the last. I tried to reassure myself that he was just anxious, maybe protective. The driveway was unmarked, no fence, only faint tire tracks in the sand, which we followed until we saw the house's dim porch light. The first night was quiet at first. The air was dry and cold, colder than I expected for March, and the desert sky was luminous with stars. The isolation was overwhelming in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. Around 11, as we were finishing dinner, we noticed movement just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was tall, far taller than a coyote, and moved slowly, deliberately. Footsteps circled the house, pausing at times but never coming closer. No voices, no sounds except the faint scuff of sand and gravel. We watched from the doorway, tense but telling ourselves it was locals playing a prank or perhaps hikers passing through. But when we checked later, there were no tracks near the edge of the light. I slept lightly that first night, the sound of the wind and the occasional shift of sand keeping me on edge. Around 2:40 a.m., I woke to a single long scrape on the exterior wall of the guest bedroom. It was low and deliberate, the kind of mark that made my stomach tighten. One long scrape, then silence. No repetition, no thumps, no scurrying. My friends woke briefly when I mentioned it, eyes wide in the dim moonlight, but none of us had an explanation. No animal we knew could make a mark like that, and nothing in the desert that night was moving the way that thing had moved. The second night brought more of the same. We tried to dismiss it during the day, exploring the few nearby formations, laughing at how jumpy we had become, but at night the pattern repeated. The pacing outside the porch light. Slow, deliberate, circling the house. The same tall shadow that kept its distance, never coming closer, never leaving. We stayed huddled together in the living room, curtains drawn, lights on, but it didn't matter. We could hear the scraping against the sand, hear the rhythm of steps that didn't belong to humans we knew. There were no roads nearby. Nothing should have been there. By the third night, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat on the porch, listening to the wind, feeling the emptiness around me press in. I tried to convince myself I had imagined the first scrape, that our nerves were stretched too thin. Then I heard it again, not at the wall this time, but just beyond the reach of the porch light. Slow steps pacing the perimeter, never approaching the door, never running, never leaving. I strained my eyes, seeing only darkness, only the edges of cacti and rocks shifting slightly in the night. I realized we had no idea who, or what, was out there, and the thought of leaving the house in the morning felt equally terrifying and necessary. When the sun rose, we discovered footprints all around the house. They were precise, measured, too even to be human, and too large for any animal I knew in that desert. Each step was deliberate, placed at regular intervals, as if whoever had walked there had practiced. We followed them around, tracing the perimeter, and every time I thought we would find a logical explanation, the footprints simply ended or disappeared into the sand. No evidence of shoes, no claws, no trail leading away. The house had been completely circled. We packed quickly and left, the drive back through the desert heavy and tense. We said nothing, each of us lost in our own thoughts, replaying the nights over and over. The host refunded us in full without explanation when we told him we were leaving early. When I tried to send a message asking why, or even just acknowledging the refund, I discovered he had blocked us immediately. No account, no number, nothing. We were left with only the memories of pacing shadows, a single scrape on the wall, and the footprints that didn't belong to anything we could name. I've thought about that trip often since. The desert is vast and silent, but there is stillness, a weight, and in that silence someone or something can move without notice. I tell myself it was a person, maybe someone watching the house for reasons I'll never understand. Maybe they were just disturbed or curious or malicious. But there's a precision in those footprints, a certainty in the pacing, that doesn't make sense. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters. I believe in people, in their patience, in what they are capable of when no one is watching. And out there, in the desert, we were completely alone, completely exposed, completely at someone else's mercy. We haven't returned, and I never will. The house remains somewhere out there, miles from any road, in total isolation, surrounded by sand, scrub, and nothing else. The host remains a mystery, and whatever circled that house those nights remains unaccounted for. It doesn't matter whether it was a person or something else. The memory of those measured steps, the scrape on the wall, the footprints too deliberate to be natural, is enough. It's enough to make me leave lights on, lock doors, and reconsider what safe really means. The desert doesn't forgive, and neither does the unknown. I rented the house with 3 co-workers as a break from the office, a long weekend to decompress and get away from the city. The listing described it as a lakefront retreat, and we were looking forward to quiet mornings on the water and evenings in a cabin surrounded by the forest. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was the front of the house facing the lake, just as advertised, but the windows were all boarded from the inside. Heavy wooden planks, nailed in place, some warped with age. The lake glimmered beyond them, but the view was blocked. I stepped closer, pressing my hand against the boards, and realized there was no way to see outside without opening them. The only clear view was from the back, where the land sloped steeply into thick forest. Tall firs and cedars crowded together, so densely the shadows seemed to move with the wind. The house itself was older, cedar siding weathered gray, shingles curling at the edges. The porch creaked underfoot. Inside, it smelled faintly of mildew, wood, and old smoke. Dust coated the window sills and the tops of furniture, but the place had been cleaned well enough to stay habitable. The bedrooms were small, one shared bathroom. The kitchen had old appliances that worked, though the fridge rattled every time the compressor kicked on. There were enough linens and towels for all of us, though the sheets smelled faintly of cedar and damp. We explored the property, noting the canoe chained to a tree near the water's edge. There was a sign tacked to the tree with sharp nails, faded and curling at the corners. Do not use the canoe after sunset. The host's rules were posted on a clipboard by the front door and were mostly mundane. No smoking indoors, no parties, take out your trash, but that line caught my attention. It wasn't the kind of warning most people gave about a canoe. We joked about it at the time, assuming it was a precaution against the lake's sudden currents or to prevent anyone from drifting off in the dark. The first night, I couldn't sleep. The lake reflected the moon faintly, silver and still. I kept peering through the narrow gap between the boards and the front window, trying to catch a glimpse of the water, but it was mostly blocked. Eventually, I went out back, crouching near the treeline. The forest was dense, the darkness nearly solid. That's when I noticed movement, subtle at first, a dark shape slipping between the trees. It didn't sway like a deer or a raccoon, didn't jump from branch to branch. It moved in straight lines, deliberate and steady. No sounds accompanied it, not even leaves crunching. Just a tall silhouette moving with exact purpose. I froze, heart hammering, waiting for a branch to snap or a twig to fall, but nothing. I could feel the other 3 co-workers behind me, tense but quiet. We didn't speak. We only watched as the figure disappeared into the black of the forest, straight and silent. The next morning, the lake was calm, glassy, reflecting the sky and the forest. At first glance, it looked perfect. Then I noticed the ripples, a single set moving toward the shore. They stopped abruptly 10 feet from where the sand met the water, paused, then slowly reversed, retreating back into the lake. None of us said anything. We just stared. Later, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe a submerged branch, a fish breaking the surface, the wind catching a tiny wave. But the motion was too precise, too intentional to be random. We left the topic unspoken, but I could feel a thread of unease hanging over the group. Inside, we began exploring more thoroughly. In one of the drawers in a side table, we found old photographs tucked beneath the top layer of junk, postcards, scraps of paper, a few coins. The photos were of the house and the surrounding forest, taken decades earlier. At first, they seemed ordinary, until we compared them to the current view. The forest looked the same, the trees in roughly the same positions, but the lake was different. Much closer to the house in the photographs, lapping near the foundations, with a small dock stretching into the water. It was as if the water had slowly receded over the years, exposing more of the shore, creating a gap between the house and the lake that hadn't existed before. We walked the perimeter of the property, measuring roughly where the water would have reached, imagining the house standing so close to the lake that waves might have lapped at the porch. It explained nothing, and yet it made the setting feel colder, emptier. The boards over the windows now made sense in a different way. They weren't just privacy or security. They kept us from seeing the water too clearly. The house's relationship to the lake had changed in some subtle but unsettling way, leaving a gap between the natural order and our perception. Evenings were the worst. The silhouettes in the trees continued, always in straight lines, never branching, never stopping, never revealing themselves. No eyes reflected light, no animal calls broke the silence. They were simply there, moving through the darkness with quiet persistence. The forest felt alive in a way that was precise and methodical, as if some unseen presence was studying us, measuring our movements, tracking our every step. On the final morning, before leaving, I walked to the canoe. It was still chained to the tree, the warning sign creased and faded. I knelt and touched the chain, ran my hands over the metal, and imagined what would happen if someone ignored the rule. The water lay still, smooth as glass. The ripple from the previous morning was gone. Everything seemed normal, and yet I knew that something about this place had been fundamentally wrong, some subtle alignment of house, water, and forest that didn't belong. When we packed the car and drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The forest receded, the lake shrinking behind us, the house disappearing among the trees. None of us spoke about it until hours later, when the highway stretched flat and the mountains in the distance were nothing but faint outlines. Even then, we didn't try to explain it. Some things don't require words. The experience left me quiet for days afterward, a slow unease that didn't have a source I could identify. The house, the lake, the moving shapes, the shifting waterline, all of it felt real, tangible, and completely impossible to ignore. Months later, I checked the listing again. It was still advertised as lakefront. The same photos used for the listing, the same vague rules. No mention of the boarded windows or the rippling water. I realized then that the house itself had a kind of privacy, a deliberate concealment that didn't need a lock or a gate. It was quiet, subtle, and unnerving in a way that left no evidence behind. It was a place built to be observed without being seen, and we had been allowed inside for reasons I still do not understand. The memory lingers, a precise line of tension running through my recollection of the trees, the lake, and the stillness that never truly faded. I arrived late in the afternoon, the kind of late where the sun leans toward the horizon, but doesn't yet promise darkness. The train station was a cavernous, echoing space, the tile floor worn and scuffed from years of passing travelers. My bag was heavy on my shoulder, and I moved through the crowd with the kind of focus that comes from carrying a mixture of exhaustion and mild anxiety. I had booked the room because it was cheap and close to the station. The online listing had been straightforward. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, nothing that would suggest complications. The price had been almost absurd, considering the area. The host met me outside the building. He was older, probably in his 60s, thin with a posture that suggested discipline more than age. He spoke English fluently, almost perfectly, but it was formal. Everything he said was precise. There were no contractions, no casual phrasing. It felt rehearsed, like a performance he had perfected over many years. He led me up a narrow stairwell, the walls scuffed and peeling in places, the steps worn unevenly, and handed me the keys. The apartment was on the third floor, a single door opening to a small landing. The space inside was clean, almost sterile. The bedroom was small, a bed tucked neatly against the far wall, a dresser, a wardrobe, a window looking out onto the street. The kitchen was functional, basic appliances, and a small table. Everything was orderly, exactly as pictured. I unpacked quickly, relieved to sit after hours of travel. The air had a faint chill, the kind that seemed to settle in corners and linger in still spaces. I noticed then the hallway that led past the kitchen, a narrow strip of wall that ended in a door I had not seen in the photos. It was locked, plain, unremarkable except for the cold air that seemed to drift out from under it. The contrast was noticeable, almost uncomfortable. That first night I heard it. Slow, deliberate scraping. Furniture, I assumed at first, the sound moving back and forth across the floor. It was coming from the locked door. I froze in bed, listening. The scraping was methodical, heavy, deliberate. It wasn't a single chair or a cabinet moving by accident. There was intent behind it. I convinced myself it was the host, moving things around at odd hours. It was quiet during the day, though. I checked in the morning. The hallway was empty, silent. The days passed slowly. I explored the city, but every night I returned, the same sound waited for me. It began at around 10, sometimes 11. I would sit on the edge of the bed, listening, trying to reason it away. I had stayed in enough small apartments to know how floors and furniture creaked. Yet this was different. The sound was controlled, consistent. Heavy scraping back and forth, with no pattern of pause or irregularity. I asked the host once about it. He smiled that tight, deliberate smile, and said, "That room is for keeping things where they belong." He said nothing more. His explanation was curt, final, leaving no room for questioning, and I found myself nodding despite a sudden unease that settled over me. By the third night, I noticed other things. The chill around the locked door seemed stronger. It pressed in when I walked past it. My skin prickled even in the warm summer air of the apartment. The hallway light sometimes flickered when I passed, just enough to make shadows dance along the walls. The apartment itself was otherwise normal. The bed was firm, the kitchen functional, the bathroom clean. Nothing else moved on its own. Nothing else made noise. Just that room. I began to pay attention to the sounds. It was subtle at first, but eventually, I realized I could tell the difference between the scraping at the edges of the door and the rest of the apartment. There was a rhythm to it, almost musical in its precision. I could hear the weight of something being shifted deliberately, the friction against the floor, the pressure it exerted. It was exhausting to listen to, mentally, every night. I started leaving the lights on in the hallway, hoping that somehow it would make the sound stop, but it did not. On the last night, I went to bed early, exhausted from the city, trying to convince myself that the sound would be gone if I slept long enough. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of breathing. It was not snoring, not the soft hissing of sleep. It was deliberate, controlled, measured. I lay perfectly still, straining to locate it, heart hammering. The sound was coming from the other side of my bedroom door. I got up slowly, every step careful, and reached for the door handle. My fingers froze on the cool metal. I pulled the door open just enough to see the hallway. The light was on, casting the narrow corridor in harsh clarity. The locked door at the end of the hallway was open. For the first time, it had not been. I could see inside. The room was empty. There was no furniture. There were no windows. Nothing except scrape marks across the bare floor. Long, dark lines, jagged in some places, straight in others, as though something had been moved back and forth repeatedly with great force. The air inside that room was colder than anything I had ever felt in my life, sharper than the summer evening outside the window. I stepped back into my room, heart racing, feeling the sweat gather at the base of my skull. I did not turn on the lights in the room. I did not make a sound. I packed quickly, methodically, making sure to leave everything as I had found it. I handed the host cash when I left, avoiding eye contact. I did not leave a review. I did not want him to know I had questioned it, or worse, to know I had seen it. The walk to the train station was calm in the bright morning light, but I could not shake the image of that empty, windowless room. The scrape marks burned in my mind. Every detail was clear. The way the floorboards were scored, the cold air, the precise rhythm of whatever had been moved in there every night. I could not explain it, and I did not try. The city behind me faded into the distance as the train carried me away. I felt a sense of relief that bordered on panic. I did not look back. I thought about that apartment for weeks afterward, the quiet, methodical sounds, the cold that seemed alive, the locked door that was never meant for me to open. I never went back. I do not know what the room was for, or what had been kept where it belonged. But I do know that some spaces are not meant to be understood, only observed from a safe distance. I booked my next stay in a modern hotel with a desk clerk who never smiled and never lingered. It was the safest choice I could make. I have stayed in countless apartments, hostels, and ghost houses across Europe and Asia since that trip. None of them left me with the same unease, the same tightening in my chest when a hallway stretches in silence. I learned to trust instinct over explanation. That room, and the deliberate sounds from behind its door, remain a single memory, stark and precise, unshakable, as real as the scrape marks on the floor. It was October 2018 when we decided to rent the farmhouse in rural western Pennsylvania. My sister's wedding was set in a small town nearby, and hotels were either sold out or exorbitantly priced. The listing seemed ideal, a renovated 1920s farmhouse, modest in cost, with clean, bright photos that promised a quiet, simple stay. I booked it without hesitation. The host messaged almost immediately, the tone overly polite, expressing thanks multiple times for respecting the rules, particularly the one about the basement. The insistence struck me as unusual, but I brushed it off as overzealous hospitality. The drive out of Pittsburgh was long and quiet, the roads narrowing as we left the highway. Fields stretched on either side, punctuated occasionally by stands of bare, skeletal trees, their branches trembling in the wind. By the time we turned onto the gravel driveway, dusk was falling. The farmhouse rose against the sky like a block of fresh paint over old wood. The smell hit me first, new paint, varnish, a kind of chemical sweetness. It was too clean, too uniform. Every surface gleamed in the fading light, the floors polished to a mirror shine. There was a sense of freshness that felt deliberate, almost manufactured, as though the house had been stripped bare and reassembled for appearances alone. The basement door was in the kitchen, a solid slab of wood with no handle on the inside. It was fastened with a deadbolt and a heavy padlock, the kind you normally see on garden sheds. The host's warning about it came back to me, the repeated emphasis in her messages suddenly sharper in tone. I ran my hand over the wood. It was smooth, unbroken, and uninviting. Nothing about it suggested ordinary use. It felt designed to discourage. The first night, I set up our son's pack-and-play in the corner of the master bedroom. He was 4, easy to soothe, but around 2 in the morning he began crying. The words were garbled at first, then clear. Someone was downstairs calling Daddy's name. I assumed it was a dream, a child's imagination. I checked the house, moving quietly through the empty hallways, but everything was in place. Nothing moved. The house was still, the only sound the faint tick of the old wall clock. I returned him to bed, convincing myself it was just fear, just shadows playing tricks. The noises didn't stop. Over the next few hours, I began noticing them myself. There were soft thumps coming at regular intervals, about 30 seconds apart. They were low, deliberate, like someone tapping a wall with care, measuring time. At first, I thought the old house was settling, the wood contracting in the cool night air. But the thumps were exact, rhythmic, unyielding, and they seemed concentrated near the basement. The HVAC system was off, or at least disconnected from the basement, so there was no air movement carrying sound from below. The sound was impossible to explain away. We tried to focus on the wedding, on our son, on the small rituals of a family visiting the countryside. In the daylight, the house seemed innocuous. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, highlighting the smooth floors and freshly painted walls. The kitchen, where the basement door dominated one side, felt normal in the afternoon, almost cheery. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was workmen who had left something behind, maybe a neighbor moving furniture, though the closest house was over half a mile away. Still, the sound persisted, always in the same place, always the same interval. The second night, the atmosphere changed entirely. Around 10 p.m., the power cut out. Initially, I assumed it was a neighborhood issue. I moved to light candles in the kitchen and living room, but the light above the basement door stayed on. It burned bright, stark against the darkened house. The effect was unsettling. All other lights, appliances, and outlets were dead. The bulb didn't flicker, didn't dim. It just glared, illuminating the door as though highlighting its importance. Shadows fell sharply against the walls, exaggerating corners and edges. The rhythmic thumps continued beneath it, more pronounced in the silence of the powerless house. I sat with my wife and son in the living room, holding him close. Every 30 seconds, the sound came. The pattern was hypnotic, terrifying in its consistency. It was not a creak, not a groan, but deliberate, almost mechanical in cadence. I examined the door by touch, tracing the padlock and deadbolt. The wood was unbroken, no scratches, no evidence that someone had been inside. The sense of being watched, of unseen presence, pressed down on me. My heart raced with tension. My stomach knotted in a mix of fear and dread I had never experienced before in a rental property. By 3 a.m., I could take it no longer. We left. We didn't pack anything. The car sat half full, the blankets and a few belongings abandoned in the rooms. I carried my son, my wife trailing behind, through the gravel driveway and onto the dark country road. The air was cold, raw with the smell of wet leaves and earth. We drove without headlights, relying on the narrow beams from passing traffic, until we reached the nearest highway. My hands were shaking as I tried to keep the car steady, my eyes straining to see. We didn't stop until we reached a motel in a nearby town, the first place with lights and an open office. I called the host repeatedly over the next day, but she never replied. I sent messages, explaining that we had left abruptly, that the house felt unsafe. There was no response, no acknowledgement. 2 weeks later, the listing disappeared entirely. It was as though the farmhouse had never existed, removed from the platform without explanation. I never discovered what the basement held. I never saw any other person around the property, never glimpsed a neighbor who could account for the sounds. I have no memory of seeing tools, maintenance equipment, or even indications that the basement was being used. The house was pristine, almost sterile, as though it had been readied for visitors, but deliberately kept inaccessible in one critical area. The thumps, the constant pattern, and the light above the basement door remain vivid in my memory. The image of that glowing bulb and the locked, smooth wood is etched into my mind more clearly than anything else from that trip. I've returned to Pennsylvania several times since, for family events and for work, but I've never attempted to revisit that area, never tried to locate the house. Even talking about it now, I feel the same unease I felt the night we fled. It was not supernatural. There was nothing visible, nothing tangible that could harm us. Yet the precision of the thumps, the unnatural focus on the basement, the host's obsessive insistence, and the disappearance of the listing together formed a scenario that was deeply, humanly disturbing. It was fear rooted in logic, in reality, in the deliberate concealment of something from us. The story ends with that flight in the middle of the night, with my son in my arms, my wife close, the farmhouse disappearing behind us in the dark. It ended because we chose to remove ourselves from the environment, because we trusted instinct over explanation. The basement was never entered, never unlocked, and the house was never used again. The terror lay in the unknown, in the human decisions that made the basement off limits, in the host's absence, in the mechanical regularity of sounds that had no clear origin. It ended with escape and distance, not revelation, and that is exactly what made it real. I have never returned, and I never will. I drove through the flat, gray landscape of the Midwest in February, the fields around us brown and wet from thawing snow, the sky low and heavy with clouds that promised more cold. My brother rode in the passenger seat, headphones in, staring out at the road that stretched straight for miles, dotted with occasional farmhouses that looked abandoned or dormant. The air inside the car was warm from the heater, but it carried the faint scent of my coffee, already cold from the long drive. We had been on the road for hours, leaving the city behind, following the GPS coordinates for a rental I had booked online after we decided to make a weekend of it. When we pulled up to the house, it looked ordinary, even slightly generic. A two-story structure painted beige, with a narrow driveway and a small, cleared yard, mostly gravel and compacted snow. There were no cars parked, no signs of life, and no mail in the mailbox. I handed the printed reservation to my brother while he scanned the house with a critical eye, his breath fogging in the cold air as he moved from window to window. He gave a slight shrug, and we both started carrying bags inside. The interior was pristine. Every surface gleamed, even under the dim late afternoon light filtering through the blinds. The floors were spotless, the counters untouched, every appliance new and polished. There was a faint chemical scent, almost like a mix of bleach and furniture polish. I noted the quietness. It wasn't the soft silence of a lived-in space. It had the unnatural stillness of a showroom. Everything was too clean, too perfect. No dust, no fingerprints, no signs that anyone had actually lived here before. The house seemed ready, almost staged for us. On the kitchen counter, there was a note on heavy cardstock. I picked it up, expecting the usual welcome message that most rentals provide, maybe with some house rules or Wi-Fi information. Instead, it addressed me by a nickname I had not used in decades, one that only my grandmother ever called me. The exact spelling, the way she had always written it in letters. I felt my stomach tighten, a flicker of unease that I tried to brush off. My brother noticed my hesitation and raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. I slipped the note back on the counter and went to check the rooms. They were identical to the kitchen, immaculately clean, orderly, and used. Beds were made with hospital-like precision, towels folded perfectly, every drawer empty except for the basics the host had provided. That evening we settled in. The house had a central heating system that kept it comfortably warm, and the walls absorbed sound, making the rooms almost unnervingly quiet. We cooked a simple dinner, the clatter of pans echoing softly, the smell of oil and onions filling the otherwise sterile air. My brother scrolled through his phone while I cleaned up, running a hand over the countertop to test the surface. It was smooth, almost too smooth, like plastic under my fingertips. I glanced around the kitchen and living area, feeling a vague tension. The house had no marks of personal life, no clutter, no signs that anyone had touched anything beyond the bare minimum. Later, after the sun had set and the house darkened, the TV in the living room turned on. At first, I thought my brother had done it accidentally, but he was already upstairs changing. The screen was black except for a slideshow that had begun automatically. My heart jumped when I saw the first image, a photo of me and my brother as children, standing in the yard of our grandparents' house, the snow piled high around our boots, both of us grinning at the camera. The second image was of me alone, a birthday photo I remembered vividly. The next photo was of my mother and grandmother in the kitchen, laughing over some recipe I didn't recognize. I moved closer to the screen, uneasy. There were more images, some familiar, some not. Old photographs of relatives I had seen once or twice, my childhood friends, neighbors, even snapshots from family gatherings I barely remembered. There were angles and moments no one outside our family could have captured. The way my brother slouched in the living room chair when he was 12, the way my grandmother held a plate at Thanksgiving. It was impossible, and the realization sank in slowly, making my stomach twist. My brother came back down the stairs, casual, but I could see the subtle tightening of his jaw when he caught sight of the TV. Neither of us said anything. I went through the house, checking the doors and windows, the locks, the electrical panels, trying to understand how any of this could have happened. Nothing seemed forced. Nothing had been broken into. It didn't make sense. The photographs weren't just online pictures. They had the texture and detail of prints, some obviously decades old. I felt exposed, as if someone had watched our entire lives and cataloged them carefully, without permission. I couldn't see a practical explanation, and the more I thought about it, the more claustrophobic the house felt. We stayed awake for hours, sitting together in the living room, staring at the screen, until exhaustion finally dragged us up the stairs to the bedrooms. The rooms themselves remained silent, ordinary, almost comforting in contrast to the living room's intrusion. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, counting the faint hums of the heating system, trying to convince myself that someone had made a mistake, that there was a logical explanation. My brother eventually fell asleep. I remained awake, turning over every possible scenario in my mind, feeling the slow creep of dread. We left the next morning, taking our bags quietly to the car, neither of us speaking much. The drive back was heavy with the residual unease of the house. The way the photographs had made me feel vulnerable in a place that should have been neutral. We didn't check our phones, didn't discuss the images, just drove, each of us lost in thought. 2 weeks later, I received a message from the Airbnb host. I opened it with a reluctant tap. The text read, "I'm glad you found what you needed." That was all. No explanation, no reference to the house, no casual pleasantries. I didn't respond. I showed it to my brother, who also did not reply. The message lingered in my mind, unanswered and unchallengeable, leaving an unsettling residue that I carried for months. In hindsight, the horror of the experience wasn't anything violent or grotesque. It wasn't the house itself, or the slideshow, or the intrusive familiarity. It was the sense of control, the knowledge that someone had constructed a space to observe, catalog, and predict every nuance of our lives without our awareness. The house was a perfect trap, not physically threatening, but psychologically invasive. Even now, months later, the memory of the note, the uncanny cleanliness, the photographs, and that final message brings a tight, cold knot of awareness in my chest. It is a reminder that privacy is fragile, and even ordinary spaces can conceal meticulous observation. The Airbnb was ordinary, mundane, and yet it was an absolute demonstration of how deeply someone could know you without ever meeting you in person. The experience ended with us driving away, the house shrinking behind us in the rearview mirror, but its presence remained. The knowledge of being cataloged lingered far longer than the weekend itself, leaving a quiet, human horror that is still impossible to shake. I rented a small guest house in suburban Texas for a week in August 2022. It was just my girlfriend and me. The house was behind the host's main property, a single-story home set back from the street, with a long, shared driveway leading past his garage to the guest house. He insisted that we were fine sharing the driveway and that it wouldn't be a problem. When we arrived, he was standing near the end of the driveway, smiling and waving. He seemed pleasant enough, overly talkative, but not alarming. I didn't notice anything at first. The guest house itself was compact but clean, a converted garage with a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and a bedroom with a queen-size bed. The floors were concrete with rugs, the walls a dull beige, the windows covered with blinds that didn't quite reach the bottom of the sill. The air smelled faintly of cleaning products and the faint chemical tang of new paint. From the start, something felt off. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the feeling you get when you walk into a room and sense a presence that isn't there. Every time we came or went, no matter the hour, he was outside. At midnight, he would water his plants under the driveway lights. At 4 a.m., he carried garbage bags to the curb and lingered there for a moment before returning inside. Dawn found him sitting in his truck, engine off, just staring down the driveway. Each time we left, he would wave and we would nod, but I started to notice how consistent it was. He never seemed to sleep. He never seemed to leave. Inside the guest house, there were small oddities we hadn't noticed in the photos. The Wi-Fi router was hidden inside a locked cabinet near the kitchenette. At first, it seemed like a minor inconvenience, but then I noticed the small ventilation holes drilled in the back of the cabinet. They were tiny, perfectly round, lined up in a straight row, and pointed directly toward the bed. It didn't make sense to me at first. Why point vents that way? I brushed it off as a coincidence. At night, the house felt different. The air was heavier, and every sound seemed amplified. At first, it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old structure. Then we began hearing the tapping. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps again. At first, my girlfriend thought it was pipes, the house settling, maybe even the neighbors somewhere down the block. But it always came from the wall that faced the main house, the wall closest to his property. The tapping stopped the instant we turned on a light. Not slowly, not with hesitation, just stopped, as if the act depended on our awareness. We tried ignoring it, focusing on our phones, reading, cooking, anything to distract ourselves. But the sound returned each night, each time in the exact pattern, always coming from the same wall. I began lying awake, counting the taps, trying to anticipate the pause, feeling my heart rate climb with each series. My girlfriend grew quiet, tense, keeping her eyes fixed on the ceiling, while I stared at the wall like it might explain itself if we watched long enough. The feeling of being watched crept into every corner of the guest house. Small details became oppressive. The blinds didn't cover the full windows, and from the street, I could almost imagine the faint shadow of the house being watched. Every time I walked past the cabinet with the Wi-Fi router, I felt exposed. The ventilation holes were aligned just so. The rational part of my brain told me I was imagining it, that I was overthinking, that maybe the holes were just for airflow, maybe the taps were nothing. But the pattern was too deliberate, too precise to be accidental. One evening, after the tapping had started again, we both sat on the edge of the bed in silence. I noticed the smoke detector in the corner of the ceiling, the same kind you see in every modern home, plain white plastic, unassuming. On a sudden impulse, I looked closely at it. It was slightly tilted, and a tiny pinhole, almost imperceptible, caught the light from the lamp. My stomach turned cold when I realized it was a camera lens, hidden inside the smoke detector, aimed directly toward the bed. I stared at it, then at the ventilation holes in the cabinet, then at the window. The house, the host, the taps, the endless watching, everything fell into place. He had been monitoring us, silently, consistently, for the entire stay. The taps were deliberate, a method of communicating, testing, reminding us he was there. The ventilation holes, the camera, the constant presence outside, it all pointed to one thing. We weren't alone. We hadn't been alone from the first moment we arrived. We packed immediately. There was no argument, no discussion. The air felt thick and heavy, oppressive, and the driveway seemed to stretch longer than it should as we moved toward our car. The host was standing outside, smiling, holding a hose as if he hadn't done anything wrong. We didn't look at him. We didn't wave. We left without turning back. Airbnb refunded us in full. They acknowledged the hidden camera and the surveillance, and they told us the listing would be investigated. But even months later, the listing was still there. The host's profile, the same photographs, the same smiling face, remained online. It was a constant reminder that the person capable of watching us undetected from such close quarters was still out there, welcoming other guests, repeating the same pattern. The experience left me hyper-aware. Every time I enter a rental, I check the smoke detectors, the air vents, the cabinets. I notice the angle of cameras, the alignment of holes in walls or furniture. The suburban streets of Texas, once familiar and mundane, suddenly felt vulnerable. The guest house was small, compact, and ostensibly safe, but safety had been an illusion. We had been watched, assessed, and manipulated without our knowledge, and there was nothing supernatural about it. It was real, calculated, and entirely human. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear the tapping, 3 pause 3. I remember the faint glint of the pinhole in the smoke detector, the tiny ventilation holes perfectly aligned toward the bed, the host standing outside at impossible hours, watching, waiting. The memory is precise, clinical, and entirely grounded in reality. It was terrifying because it was entirely believable, entirely possible, and entirely real. The horror wasn't the unknown. It was the certainty that someone had been observing every moment, every private gesture, in a space where we should have felt completely safe. We never returned to that neighborhood, never stayed in a guest house behind another home. Every time I see a rental online, I imagine the host somewhere nearby, always present, waiting for the next guest to make a mistake. The story doesn't end with confrontation, with a dramatic escape, or with a heroic moment. It ends with awareness, with knowledge, and with the quiet, lingering fear of someone who has learned that safety is fragile and observation is relentless. The Airbnb refund helped, but it didn't erase the memory, the certainty, the fact that we had been watched in a place where we should have been free, alone, and entirely unobserved.